Ever since Steve Jobs passed away and Tim Cook took over control at Apple, Tim has had a singular quest. No, it's not figuring out the perfect size for an iPhone. And no, it's not discovering the next innovative device that Apple can create. And no, unfortunately, it doesn't have anything to do with the Vision Pro. Tim Cook's singular quest, crusade even, is to remove the letter I from every single product in the Apple ecosystem. Want to learn more about it? Stick around, this is going to get interesting. I'm Dylan Stewart, the Mac Whisperer, and in this very different Mac Whisperer video, we're going to tackle one of Apple's biggest challenges, the way they name their products, devices, and services. There's a ton of issues and they've been around since the very beginning. But I'm not one to drop a bunch of problems and complaints without offering some solutions. So make sure to stick around for the end of this video where I reveal how I would fix things. Apple's naming problems begin right at the start of Apple. When Steve Jobs created the company, naming it Apple and deciding to use the image of an apple for their logo, he didn't bother to see if the name or the logo were already trademarked. As it turned out, a small company run by 4 shaggy-haired British musicians had already named their company Apple and decided to use an apple as the logo. That's right, the Beatles had created a company back in 1968 called Apple Corps, and this was the company that the Beatles used for all of their music rights, all of their film projects, and even a fashion brand. But Steve Jobs didn't pay any attention, he just named his company Apple. And of course, as soon as he did, the Beatles had to sue him. This started right in 1978, and the problem with the Apple trademark name would take almost 30 years for it to get resolved. When the first lawsuit happened, Steve and Apple computers were just getting started, so he didn't have a lot of options. He ended up paying Apple Corps $80,000 for the rights to use the name Apple and the logo. But there was a very strong restriction in that agreement. The restriction was that Apple computers could never do anything in the music industry. That was reserved for the Beatles' Apple Corps. But Steve Jobs doesn't really like playing by the rules. So within a couple of years, Apple computers added the capability of importing music into the computer using a MIDI keyboard. Well, as soon as that happened, the Beatles had to sue Steve again. And he lost again. This time it cost him a couple of $1 million. But that's not the end of the story. In 2003, after creating the iPod, Apple decided to create the iTunes Store, letting people download and purchase songs directly from Apple and import them to their brand new iPods. Well, as you can figure, the Beatles didn't love that that happened, so they created another lawsuit. But something was different in this third lawsuit. When it was brought to court, the court agreed that Apple was staying in their lane. Yes, they were allowing you to purchase music and import music, but that didn't mean they were in the music industry. So Apple ended up winning the third lawsuit. But Steve didn't want to have any further battles with the Beatles, and he was flush with cash because Apple was a success at this point. So he made an agreement with the Beatles where he purchased all of the licenses. He purchased the full license for the name Apple and for the Apple logo, and then he licensed them back to the Beatles solely for music production. And after 30 years, that finally concluded the battle over the name of Apple. But it wasn't the last time that Apple would run into naming problems. Steve Jobs had a specific philosophy about how he wanted to name things. He wanted the names to be unique, simple, intuitive, reflect the product's purpose, and resonate with customers, which means he couldn't just give any names to his products, they had to be special. And the first one that he hit out of the park was the iMac. It was simple, it was easy. There was nothing else like the iMac on the market. The little letter I symbolized simplicity, symbolized instant internet connectivity, symbolized intuitive. And so Apple began to use the I on all of their products. You had the iPod, the iPad, the iPhone, you had iCloud, you had iBooks, you had iTunes. Everything that had the little I at the beginning was unique. And it meant that it was made by Apple and you were going to love using it. It's a great system, but over time that system hit some other snags. For example, the iPhone was misnamed almost right off the bat. The first iPhone was released in 2007, and it was called iPhone. But the second iPhone, released a year later, was called the iPhone 3G, which was referencing the cellular network that it was on, which was a new cellular network at that time. Now we've got 5G, but 3G was a really big deal. However, the third iPhone, they decided to add the letter S to the name, which I guess signified speed or special or something. And so the third iPhone was called the iPhone 3GS. What's the G doing there? It has nothing to do with the name of the iPhone, but they left it in there. With the iPhone 4, they finally had the right number. The iPhone 4 was the fourth iPhone, and they should have stopped there, but then they went back to that stupid S. This time the 4S came out, and maybe the S stood for Siri or something else? Nobody really knows what the S stood for. But immediately, the fifth iPhone is called the iPhone 4S. With the iPhone 6, we introduce a new size, and all of a sudden you've got the iPhone 6 and the iPhone 6 Plus. A year later, the iPhone 6S and the iPhone 6S Plus, and it just gets worse and worse. It gets so bad that when Apple releases the iPhone 8 next to the iPhone 10, which was called the iPhone X but was supposed to be pronounced as the iPhone 10, it was meant to signify a change in the way they were naming iPhones and also to celebrate the iPhone's 10-year anniversary. And to make the numbers match up a little bit better, they skipped the iPhone 9. So you had the iPhone 8 and then you had the iPhone X, pronounced iPhone 10. Everything would have been fine if they'd stuck to that new naming convention, but the very next year they throw it all away by creating the iPhone XR. What did the R stand for? And the iPhone XS. Not the iPhone XS, but the iPhone XS, unless you're supposed to call the X a 10. I don't really know. Is it then the iPhone XR? It doesn't make any sense. Now that you have multiple sizes for your phones, you end up with a plus size phone or a max size phone. Then they differentiated between the consumer level phone and the pro level phone. But then they added a mini phone. So by the iPhone 12, you've got the iPhone 12, the iPhone 12 Pro, the iPhone 12 mini, and I'm already confused. Then they release another iPhone model called the iPhone SE. The iPhone SE stood for Special Edition, we think, and was meant as a low entry price iPhone, just adding one more iPhone to this naming mess. Each release of the iPhone SE was just called the iPhone SE, so you didn't know whether you had the first one or the second one. Then with the iPhone 16, we made an even bigger mess. You've got the consumer level iPhone 16, you've got the iPhone 16 Plus, which is the larger size, you've got the iPhone 16 Pro, you've got the iPhone 16 Pro Max, which is the larger size. Why can't we call them both Plus or call them both Max? Just unify the names a little bit here. Help me out a little bit, Apple. And then in 2025, when the iPhone SE got rebuilt, they called it the iPhone 16e. So you've got an iPhone 16, a 16 Plus, a 16 Pro, a 16 Pro Max, and a 16e? Come on, guys. It's just too complicated. And if you think that the iPhone naming issue is a problem, we should definitely talk about the iPad naming issue, because that's even worse. The iPad currently has 4 completely distinct models. You've got the standard iPad, the iPad Air, which is supposed to be light, the iPad Pro for professionals, and the iPad Mini. The iPad Air and the iPad Pro both come in an 11-inch and a 13-inch size, but we didn't call it the iPad Air Plus or the iPad Air Max. So once again, there's no consistency in the naming and it results in complications. The iPad naming convention was so dumb that one of the iPads is literally called the new iPad, even though it's 15 years old. Which model was it? Who knows? It's just called the new iPad. And so as Apple updates their iPads year after year, there's a billion different versions, most of which are still available. So you could get the iPad standard 10th generation or 9th generation. You could get the iPad Air 6th generation or 5th generation. You could get the iPad Mini 6th generation or 5th generation. And all of a sudden, I'm confused. This is Apple's naming problem at its core. A lack of consistency, a lack of simplicity, and a complete disregard for being intuitive. Steve would be so disappointed in Tim. But Tim has bigger fish to fry, because as Tim stepped into the reins of Apple, he had big shoes to fill, and he was standing in the shadow of that big lowercase I that Steve had created with the iMac and the iPhone and the iPad. And so Tim wanted to blaze his own trail. When he created his first major device, the Apple Watch, it was not called the iWatch. It was just called the Apple Watch. He was taking the name from the Apple TV. When Steve created the Apple TV, he wanted to call it the iTV, but there was already a British service called iTV, so he couldn't get the trademark. The young Steve Jobs would have fought for it. He would have named it the iTV anyways and dealt with all of the lawsuits that came afterwards. But this aging Steve Jobs decided to let iTV run with it and name the Apple TV the Apple TV. So Tim Cook took the inspiration from the Apple TV to start to remove the letter I. And he started with one of the most iconic I programs that Apple had ever created, iTunes. And he took iTunes and split it into 3 separate programs: Music, Podcasts, and Apple TV. Apple TV was already a device, but now it's also an app. And to make matters worse, they also announced the Apple TV Plus service, which is a paid service. So when someone talks about an Apple TV, you have to stop and go, are you talking about the box you plug into your television set? Are you talking about the app on your phone, iPad, and computer? Or are you talking about the Apple TV Plus service with shows like Ted Lasso and Severance? It's really confusing, and it's indicative of some of the problems that Tim would step into as he eliminated the I. He was immediately going against Steve's naming philosophy of keeping things simple and keeping things unique. And it only gets worse. You see, Apple Music is not the same as the Music app. I know that's confusing, right? When iTunes got broken up, it created an app called the Music app. The Music app has a service that you can connect to it, but it's not necessary. You do not need to have Apple Music in order to run the Music app. The Music app is basically iTunes with a different name. But Apple Music is a service that gives you access to download or listen to any music in the iTunes store. But since the names were so similar, most users believed that the Music app and Apple Music were the same thing, and that they had to pay a subscription to listen to songs that they'd purchased from iTunes, which is just wrong. But the problem doesn't stop there, because one of the things that was nice about iTunes or iCal or iBooks is that when you would do a Google search trying to solve a problem, you would get results of iTunes-related issues. But if you do music issues, you're going to get a ton of solutions that have to do with Spotify, Pandora, headphones, hearing aids, and all sorts of things, because music is not a specific name. It's a generic name. So you might think, well, if I search Apple Music issues, then I'll get it. No, you'll get issues with the Apple Music service, not with the Apple Music app, which is just making things complicated. You can't search for iBooks anymore or iCal anymore because iBooks is called Books, which is a generic name, and iCal is called Calendar, which is just so frustrating. So in his quest to blaze his own trail and leave his own legacy, Tim Cook has left nothing but confusion in his wake. Most Apple clients just want things to be simple and easy, but Tim doesn't realize that his simplification of these names is creating a ton of issues. Apple's naming problems even have to do with the operating systems that they name. For the iPhone, it's always been called iOS with a number, which is easy. The iPad, same thing. But for the computer, it's always been given a code name. And those code names have existed from the very beginning of macOS X, which was called Puma. In those days, the Mac operating systems were named based on cats. So you had Puma and Tiger and Leopard. But as they started to run out of cats, they doubled down. Suddenly you had Snow Leopard and Mountain Lion and all sorts of other cats until they went, we're out of cats. And so they decided to switch how they were naming their Mac operating systems by using landmarks in California. Now we've got Mac operating systems like Sequoia and Sonoma and Monterey and El Capitan and Yosemite, which sound great, but they really don't mean anything. It's very hard for someone to know that Catalina is not as powerful or as new as Sonoma or Sequoia, And what's going to happen when Apple runs out of California landmarks? Are they going to start taking global landmarks? Are we going to have macOS Eiffel Tower or macOS Mount Rushmore? I mean, these things are stupid, guys. We just need to simplify it. I don't mind if every Mac operating system is just macOS 14 or macOS 15. It doesn't need the code name. It's fun and all, but it just complicates things for the average user who doesn't understand the difference of Monterey and Sonoma, but they could clearly understand the difference of 14 and 15. So as you can see, Apple's got a ton of naming issues, and it's been a problem ever since the beginning of Apple. But as I said earlier, I'm not one to bring a bunch of problems and just lay them on Tim Cook's table. I've got a solution. But before I deliver my solution, if you learned something new, if you liked this new kind of MacWhisperer video, if you had a lot of fun with what I brought to you so far, give this video a thumbs up. It'll make it so much easier for other people to find it, and it'll help me know that you want more of these videos. And if you've got a comment, a question, something you want to ask about, or something you want to share about your own opinion of Apple's stupid naming system, drop it in the comments section. I love to hear from you guys. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, it's time. Hit that subscribe button and that notify bell so you're always alerted whenever I drop new content. And with that being said, let's get into the MacWhisperer solution. When Steve Jobs was first brought back into Apple, there's a famous story of him walking into a boardroom and drawing 4 squares on the whiteboard there and simplifying their product lineup. In those days, there were so many different computers and devices that Apple was making that it was impossible to keep track. You had the Power Mac, and the Macintosh LC, and the Macintosh Quadra, and the Macintosh Performa. With all of these different products, Apple had gotten fragmented. So when Steve Jobs came into the boardroom, it was his purpose to simplify Apple and put it back on the right track. Make things easy, make things intuitive. So he said, it's very simple, guys. You've got the consumer level products and the professional level products. You've got the laptops and you've got the desktops. So here's how it's going to work. We want one consumer level desktop. We'll call it the iMac. We want one professional level desktop. We'll call it the Power Mac. We want one consumer level laptop. We'll call it the iBook. And we want one professional level laptop. We'll call it the PowerBook. And suddenly things were simple. They eliminated 70% of their product line during that one meeting, but it set the stage for Apple to take off. Suddenly they weren't encumbered by all of these different products and all of this fragmented device line. And Apple was a success from that point on, specifically because of focus. So Tim, I'm going to channel my inner Steve Jobs. If I were to be Steve Jobs and step into the boardroom with the Apple executives, I would grab the whiteboard and I would follow Steve's model. The first thing we need to do is fix the iPad lineup because that's the biggest mess of all of them. So the 3 boxes will be used for a consumer product, a professional product, and a miniature product. Under the iPad line, we have the consumer product. I would say go with the iPad Air. The iPad Standard is a slow machine that's just not worth it. Yes, you might have to bring the price of the iPad Air down a little bit to make it an easier entry-level device, but I think you've got the money to be able to do that. And you can have 2 sizes, but you don't need to give them names. It's just the 11-inch size and the 13-inch size. Now let's go for the professional tablet. iPad Pro, also available in an 11-inch size and a 13-inch size. Then let's go for the miniature product, the iPad mini. And we're done. See how simple this is, Tim? Now let's take the next step. Let's look at our phones. First off, we've got the consumer level phone. I would just do the iPhone 16. I would get rid of the iPhone 16e and I would reduce the price of the iPhone 16 to make it a true entry-level iPhone. For the Pro level, we've got the iPhone 16 Pro. Both phones have 2 sizes. We don't need to give them names. One is the big size and one is the standard size. But here's what you're going to have to do with the miniature phone. Back with the iPhone 12 and the iPhone 13, Apple released a small size phone called the iPhone 12 mini and the iPhone 13 mini. It didn't sell gangbusters, but many of my clients, especially older people, prefer the smaller size. Women would rather have a smaller size phone so they don't need to carry a big purse to that cocktail party. So you're going to have to bring back the miniature size phone, and we'll call it, wait for it, the 16 mini. Now it's simple. We've got 3 phones, the 16 Pro, and the 16 mini. This is easy. Let's step over to the laptop section and fix that up as well. Pretty simple. For the consumer product, we've got the MacBook Air. And for the professional product, we've got the MacBook Pro. Once again, they can have different sizes. That doesn't matter. They don't need different names. You've got the MacBook Air with 13 and 15 inches. You've got the MacBook Pro with 14 and 16 inches. But I'd like you to create a new laptop, and I'd like it to be called the MacBook Mini. And it should be an 11 or 12-inch sized MacBook that has good functionality and a smaller footprint. You used to make an 11-inch MacBook Air. Just bring it back. Some people want a smaller screen. And now, let's move over to the desktop section. The consumer level is the iMac. The Pro level is the Mac Pro. And the Mini level, you guessed it, the Mac Mini. All of a sudden, that's done. Look at how simple that is. 3 products with a couple of different sizes for each of your separate categories. Now, I'd like to introduce some new rules for Apple moving forward. Stop updating the software every year. Do it every 2 years. No one's going to mind. Plus, it'll give you a chance to fix all of the problems that crop up every time you upgrade the operating system. We want to make sure everything just works. Remember that logo? It just works. Most of the time it doesn't with Apple right now, because as they release new operating systems on a yearly basis, by the time the next one is due, they still haven't fixed the prior one. We're going to see that happen when they release the iOS 19 update later this year, because iOS 18 still isn't finished. There's all sorts of features and functions that were promised last year that haven't been delivered, and Apple Intelligence is a bit of a mess and needs all sorts of work. So before you put all of those resources into developing the next operating system, slow your roll, Tim. Let's get iOS 18 perfect first. And when I talk about not updating every year, I mean that across the board. We do not need a brand new iPhone every year. Think about the resources you could save if you weren't trying to reinvent the iPhone every year. And you're doing a terrible job of reinventing it anyways, because the iPhone 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16 are indifferentiable. The only way to know the difference is if you remember which phone you bought, or going into settings to check your model. That's dumb. You could easily tell the difference between the iPhone 4 and the iPhone 5. They were a different shape. The iPhone 5 and the iPhone 6 were different sizes. There's easy ways to differentiate when you do upgrade a product. So don't find it necessary to upgrade every product every year and to upgrade the software every year. By simplifying this lineup, you solve multiple problems at the same time. You solve the franticness of creating new products and new software every year. You solve the naming conventions so your customers know which iPhone is for them. Am I a consumer? Am I a professional? Do I like things that are small, easy, and simple? And it also gives you a reoccurring schedule to update all of the other devices so that they don't fall by the wayside and get forgotten about. Now, nobody asked me, but that's how I would solve things if I was working at Apple. And I strongly recommend Tim and the rest of the Apple team taking heed. I've been on Apple products since the very, very beginning. I had the Apple II, I had the Mac. I've used every Apple product even through the dark days when John Sculley was running the company and making a mess out of all the Quadra and Performas. I understand what makes Apple users crazy because A, I'm an Apple user, and B, my job is solving the problems when Apple users get crazy. This would solve so many issues all at the same time. It would save money, and it would allow you to continue to be a company where things just work. And for God's sake, Tim, it's time to bury the hatchet with the letter I. I mean, what did the letter I ever really do to you, Tim? You know you've got the letter I in your first name, right? Let it go. Give it up. Start to focus on making things simple again. Find names that are unique. Create a system for the names so that Plus means something, Max means something, Pro means something, Air means something, or use different words that already mean something. And while you're at it, please leave the name of our programs alone. I really don't want to see you rename Safari to be called Browser. It's already bad enough that Mac Mail is called Mail. These are some of my biggest gripes and some of my biggest issues, and I plan on recording more rants and raves like this. So if you like what you saw today, make sure you give it a thumbs up and leave a comment. This has been the MacWhisperer Rant about Apple's naming convention. I hope you learned a lot, but remember, there's always something more to learn. Check out this video for more amazing tips and tricks on how to use your Apple devices properly. I'm Dylan Stewart, the Mac Whisperer, and I'll see you at my next rant.